It begins with a vision so absurd it feels like theatre, yet it was no play, no comedy staged for the amusement of courtiers or nobles. Imagine the hushed interior of a cathedral-like hall in 16th century France, the thick smell of wax candles filling the vaulted air, the solemnity of a court assembled in full regalia. Magistrates sit high upon their benches, draped in robes of authority, their faces grave and lined with duty. Clerks shuffle parchments. A hush spreads across the chamber, not from reverence for the law, but from disbelief at the trial about to unfold. For before them stands no murderer, no thief, no heretic, at least not in human form, but rather the accusation of an entire species, the rats of autumn, summoned by the power of church and law to answer for their crimes against mankind. The charge was not a trivial one. The year was 1522, and famine had already gnawed at the countryside, tightening its grip on the bellies of peasants. Grain, precious and scarce, was vanishing from storage bins and granaries, and suspicion fell upon the uninvited guests that multiplied in the shadows. The rats, countless, insatiable, their teeth sinking into humanity's fragile survival. In an age when hunger was both constant companion and mortal threat, the destruction of food was no small offense. It was sacrilege against the fragile pact between God, man, and harvest. And so the townspeople demanded justice. Yet justice, in its grim majesty, required ritual. These were no ordinary vermin. They were defendants, to be tried as any man would be, with prosecutors, judges, witnesses, and, most remarkably of all, counsel for the defense. At the center of this strange theater stood one of the most brilliant and eccentric lawyers of the age, Bartholomew Chasseneuil, a man whose reputation for cunning had already begun to spread across France. It was he who took upon himself the impossible task, to defend the rats of autumn against the wrath of an entire town, against the dignity of a court convinced that God's law extended even to the smallest and most despised of his creatures. To modern ears, the idea seems laughable, a parody of justice, but in the early 16th century, such spectacles were neither rare nor comedic. Europe was alive with belief in a world where the divine order extended downward into every crevice of creation. Animals, no less than men, were seen as capable of offending God's plan, and therefore subject to the rituals of justice. Pigs that killed children, cows that gored their masters, insects that ruined crops. Each could be summoned to trial, tried, sentenced, and punished as if they bore the full moral weight of humanity. For to leave such offences unaddressed was to risk divine displeasure, to invite further calamity upon community and soul alike. In this atmosphere, the trial of the rats was not madness, it was necessity. Autumn, like many medieval towns, lay under the heavy cloak of religious law, where every act of destruction, every misfortune, was bound up with questions of morality, punishment, and expiation. If the rats were guilty and went unpunished, who knew what greater disaster God might send? So the judges sat, solemn and unmoving, as the case was read aloud. The rats of autumn, being charged with the theft and consumption of grain, were to present themselves before the court to answer for their crimes. The prosecutor thundered against them, condemning their havoc, invoking the hunger of widows and the cries of children robbed of bread. And then, in one of the most surreal moments in legal history, the defense rose. Chasseneuil, young yet already brilliant, stood before the bench not to laugh, not to mock, but to argue with every fiber of rhetorical genius that his clients, the rats, deserved fair treatment under the very laws the court claimed to uphold. His voice carried with grave sincerity, and in that moment the absurdity transformed into something haunting. For the question was no longer whether rats could be punished, but whether law itself could remain just when stretched beyond the boundaries of common sense. Chasseneuil began with a principle so simple it cut like steel. The rats, though accused, had not been properly summoned. By law, every defendant was entitled to citation and notice, so that he might appear to defend himself. Yet how could a summons be delivered to creatures scattered across the countryside, burrowed deep in barns, fields, and cellars? The court had, in fact, posted announcements in the churches, calling upon all rats to appear. But Chassanet raised a withering objection. A summons that could not be reasonably heard was no summons at all. Rats, he argued, could not be expected to attend if the notice was inadequate, if the means of communication were flawed. A murmur spread among the assembly. The judges shifted in discomfort. What began as farce was now knotted in the thorns of legal procedure, but Chassanet was not finished. He pointed out that even had the summons been properly delivered, the journey to court was fraught with peril. The rats, he declared, lived under constant threat of their mortal enemies, the cats of the town, prowling the streets and alleys. To demand that the rats appear was, in effect, to demand that they risk their lives merely to submit to trial. No law, he proclaimed, could require a defendant to hazard death simply to answer an accusation. And thus, with masterful solemnity, he demanded protection for his clients, safe conduct to ensure their passage. Until such guarantees could be provided, the rats could not, in good conscience, be expected to present themselves before the bench. The hall erupted in astonishment. Some laughed openly, others shook their heads in disbelief. Yet beneath the laughter was a strange, gnawing unease, for the lawyer's words, absurd though their context, were unassailable in their logic. If justice was to be truly just, then even vermin must be granted the protections afforded to man. And if those protections could not be given, then perhaps justice itself was impossible. The judges, caught between ridicule and reason, adjourned in confusion. The trial stretched on week after week, as Chassanet continued to spin his web of legal defense, filing objections, demanding due process, insisting that the dignity of the court required equal treatment even for creatures despised. The rats, of course, never appeared. But their absence became the heart of the case, a mirror held up to the absurdities of human law when carried to extremes. It was not merely a battle over vermin. It was a duel between reason and ritual, between the majesty of law and the hunger of the people, between the need for justice and the impossibility of its practice, when reality itself refused to comply. And in that duel, Autumn would find itself humiliated, trapped in the spectacle of its own creation, with a town starving while its judges debated the rights of rats. The courtroom of Autumn became a theater of contradiction. Every session began with solemnity, as if the fate of nations were at stake, and every session ended in whispers, chuckles, or muttered curses. Outside, the peasants waited, their anger sharpened by hunger. Their granaries were still plagued by scurrying shadows, yet the court droned on about procedure and fairness, about the moral obligations owed to creatures that most men crushed without hesitation beneath a boot. The absurdity festered, but it was not without danger. For beneath the ridiculous mask of this trial lay something that gnawed at deeper questions. What is justice when stretched to absurdity? Where does authority end when it insists on punishing the ungovernable? Could a court that failed to discipline rats still hope to discipline men? Chassanet, for his part, seemed immune to ridicule. Each appearance he made before the magistrates was a performance of brilliance, his eyes bright with intellectual fire, his words woven with equal parts piety and razor logic. He spoke of the dignity of law, of God's order, of the necessity of fairness even toward the most despised. And yet, one could not help but suspect that beneath his solemn tone there flickered a spark of irony, a sly recognition that he was both exposing and mocking the very institution that gave him voice. If rats could not be judged fairly, what did that say about the justice meted out to men? If the law faltered here, might it falter everywhere? The judges, trapped in their own piety, dared not dismiss the proceedings outright. To do so would invite accusations of negligence, perhaps even sacrilege, for the church itself had sanctioned animal trials for centuries. So they listened, session after session, as Chassanet raised objection after objection. First, the summons had not been sufficient. Then, the danger posed by cats rendered attendance impossible. When the prosecutor scoffed, Chassanet leaned into his rhetoric with ferocity. Did the court not, in trials of men, provide protections for witnesses and defendants traveling under threat? Did envoys not receive safe conduct even when crossing hostile lands? Why, then, should rats be treated with less respect? To demand their presence without guaranteeing safety was not justice, it was ambush. The brilliance of his defense spread beyond the court walls. Word carried through Autumn, then to neighboring towns, then across France. A lawyer was standing in defense of rats and winning, not by trickery or laughter, but by wielding the very principles of law itself. His reputation grew, even as the townspeople seethed. The grain continued to vanish, the rats continued their nightly raids, and the judges continued to deliberate. Meanwhile, children wasted with hunger, and fields yielded too little to replenish the stores. The spectacle of the trial became almost unbearable. While the poor starved, the law busied itself with demands for safe passage for vermin. Yet there was method in Chassenet's persistence. He was not merely buying time, nor merely amusing himself at the expense of court and crown. He was carving his name into history by showing that law, when applied without thought, collapses into farce. He forced the judges to confront their own absurdity, compelled them to follow their principles to their logical, yet impossible, conclusion. His tactics were as much philosophy as jurisprudence, exposing the tension between the letter of the law and the reality of the world it sought to govern. As weeks turned to months, the strain began to show. The prosecutor, once fiery in his denunciations, grew weary of Chassenet's endless objections. The magistrates sighed more heavily with each session. The people outside muttered that justice had become a plaything of clever men, while their children went hungry. And still, the rats remained absent, unseen defendants in a courtroom drama that devoured time and dignity. The case teetered between tragedy and comedy. A grotesque ballet danced on the razor's edge of absurdity. Finally, the court attempted to force the issue. A new summons was issued, more elaborate than before, read aloud from church pulpits across the countryside. The words rang through the stone walls of chapels and echoed across fields. All rats of Autumn and its surrounding villages were hereby commanded to appear before the tribunal to answer the charges of grain theft. Parish priests, uneasy but obedient, read the decree with faces of stone. Farmers, listening from the pews, shifted uncomfortably. Some laughed under their breath. Others crossed themselves, fearful that even mockery might bring God's disfavor. But again, the defendants did not appear. Instead, there came more silence, more gnawing in the granaries, more evidence that the accused were beyond the reach of summons or scripture. The court reconvened. The prosecutor demanded judgment in absentia. "They have defied the authority of the law," he thundered. "Their absence is guilt." But Chassenet rose with the calm certainty of a man who knows he has won the field before the first blow is struck. He argued that absence could not equal guilt when the conditions for presence were impossible. The rats had legitimate cause to fear for their lives. Without protection, without safe passage, they were not fugitives, but victims. To condemn them now would be to condemn any defendant who failed to appear out of fear, a precedent so dangerous it could unravel the very fabric of justice. The court faltered. The magistrates, trapped by the chains of their own logic, hesitated. They could not admit defeat, but neither could they issue judgment without undermining their own principles. And so the trial dragged further, an endless cycle of summons and objection, accusation and defense, with no resolution in sight. Outside, famine deepened. The people of Autumn, watching their stores vanish and their patience thin, began to mutter that the court was bewitched, that Chassenet himself must be possessed by some demon of sophistry. Yet others, secretly, admired him, whispering that he had unmasked the law for what it truly was, a fragile illusion, powerful only so long as men believed in it. In the end, the trial became less about rats and more about the town itself. Autumn was on trial, its institutions, its faith in order, its desperate need to control the uncontrollable. The rats continued their nightly feasts, untouched, unpunished, unstoppable. The judges, unable to sentence them, looked increasingly like fools. And Chassenet, standing tall in the midst of chaos, emerged not as a clown, but as a prophet of law's limitations. He had turned absurdity into revelation, and though the people cursed him, his reputation soared. for who could deny the brilliance of a man who defended the indefensible, and in doing so, revealed that perhaps the true vermin were not in the granaries but in the hollow rituals of justice itself. As the weeks turned into months and the months into nearly a year, the absurd weight of the trial bore down upon Autumn like an illness that could not be shaken. The summons had been read, the objections answered, the grain continued to vanish, and yet no verdict ever came. What began as a legal procedure had curdled into theatre, a grotesque parody of justice in which the defendants remained invisible and the accusers grew hungrier by the day. Farmers who had once trudged to court to hear the proceedings now stayed home, muttering curses into their fields. Mothers watched their children's bellies swell from hunger, while magistrates argued about safe conduct for vermin. The anger of the people grew sharp, directed not only at the rats, but at the very court that had promised justice and delivered only laughter. In this atmosphere, Chassaignet's name spread further still. His defense had elevated him from a provincial lawyer into a figure of fascination across France. Reports of the trial reached Paris, and even beyond, carried by travelers and merchants who retold the story with equal parts wonder and derision. In Autumn, they said, rats had become litigants, and a lawyer had outwitted a court of law by arguing for their right to safety. For some, it was proof that France had sunk into farce. For others, it was a brilliant satire of justice itself. The paradox was that Chassaigne had built his fame on a case that could never end, because its very absurdity prevented resolution. The judges, trapped in this stalemate, grew desperate for escape. But how could they end a trial whose defendant could never appear, without admitting that the proceedings had been folly from the start? To dismiss the case outright would shame the court and undermine faith in its authority. To convict in absentia would expose the hypocrisy of their own principles. They were cornered, as much prisoners of the process as the peasants were prisoners of their famine. In the silence of their deliberations, they began to speak less of justice and more of reputation, less of rats and more of their own survival as a credible institution. Meanwhile, Chassaignet's defense took on a life of its own, becoming a kind of allegory whispered in taverns and marketplaces. Some saw in it a condemnation of corruption. If a court could waste its time chasing rats while men starved, what else might it squander its authority upon? Others interpreted it as divine irony, that God, in his infinite wisdom, had chosen vermin to reveal the vanity of human institutions. And among lawyers and clerics, a subtler debate brewed. Was it not true that animals, like men, were part of God's creation and therefore subject to his law? If so, was not Chassaigne simply taking the logic of church tradition to its natural end? The more one thought of it, the less absurd it seemed, and the more terrifying. If the law was absurd here, where else might it be absurd? But time, that great enemy of spectacle, ground the trial into dust. Interest waned, proceedings slowed, famine worsened, and gradually, without verdict or closure, the case slipped into silence. The rats were never condemned, never pardoned, never formally judged. They simply went on with their lives, breeding, feasting, vanishing into the night, while the town staggered under the humiliation of having failed to bring them to account. The court quietly shelved the proceedings, the judges turning their attention to other matters, never again speaking of the trial that had mocked them so completely. And yet, Chassaigne emerged unscathed. More than unscathed, he flourished. His eloquence and cunning during the trial of the rats had won him a reputation as a master of law, a defender whose brilliance could twist even absurdity into triumph. He rose in prominence, his career carrying him eventually to the rank of a celebrated jurist, a man cited with reverence in later centuries. What had been mockery for the town became glory for the lawyer. The people of Autumn had lost not only their grain but their dignity, and the memory of their suffering was overshadowed by the legend of the man who had once defended rats with greater seriousness than most men received in court. For Autumn, however, the memory never faded. To be the town that had tried and failed to convict vermin was a wound to its pride, a story retold with bitter laughter by neighbors for generations. In taverns across Burgundy, men would raise their cups and toast to autumn, the town that could not outwit a rat. Children whispered the tale as a warning, that hunger would drive even the wisest men into folly, that justice could devour itself when it lost sight of reason. And in time, the story spread further still, becoming one of those strange medieval anecdotes preserved in chronicles and histories, half fable and half truth, a testament to the fragility of law when confronted with the absurd. The trial of the rats was never about rats. It was about fear, hunger, and the desperate human need to impose order upon chaos. The vermin, in their silent defiance, became symbols of the uncontrollable forces that gnawed at the margins of medieval life: plague, famine, war, the inscrutable will of God. To summon them was to summon every anxiety that haunted the medieval world, and to fail to control them was to admit that man's structures of law and faith were little more than fragile walls against an indifferent universe. The humiliation of autumn lay not in the presence of rats, but in the revelation that even justice itself was powerless against the small, the unseen, the countless. And so the town was left with its shame, the rats with their freedom, and Chasseneuil with his fame. The paradox endured. Justice had been sought, and in seeking it, justice had been mocked. Law had been applied, and in applying it, law had been undone. Centuries later, historians would look back on the case and laugh, as if it were merely a curiosity, a medieval oddity to amuse modern minds. But to the people who starved in autumn, there was nothing amusing in the sight of magistrates debating the rights of vermin while their children cried for bread. The laughter belonged to those who came after. For those who lived through it, the trial of the rats was not comedy, but tragedy. A reminder that when institutions lose touch with reality, the people suffer, and the powerless, in this case both peasants and rats, slip through the cracks. The trial at autumn may have faded into silence without a verdict, but its echoes carried far beyond the town's walls, for autumn was not alone in its absurdity. Across Europe in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, animals found themselves in courtrooms with startling regularity, tried for crimes that ranged from theft to murder. Pigs that killed children, roosters accused of laying eggs, locusts that devoured crops. All were summoned before tribunals of men, judged with solemn ritual, and often sentenced to death or banishment. These were not isolated curiosities, but reflections of a worldview in which the boundary between man and beast was thinner than it would later become. To put an animal on trial was to insist that all of creation lay beneath God's law, and that no act of violence, however small, escaped the reach of human judgment. Yet the case of autumn stands out, not only for its absurdity, but for the clarity with which it revealed the fragility of law itself. When Chasseneuil argued for the rats, he was not inventing a joke. He was pressing the logic of medieval jurisprudence to its breaking point. If animals were to be judged as men, then surely they deserved the protections of men. If the law was to claim universality, then surely it must be consistent, even when consistency became ridiculous. The court, trapped in its own principles, could neither convict nor acquit without undermining itself. In exposing this contradiction, Chasseneuil revealed what philosophers would later articulate more fully, that law is not an absolute, but a human construct, dependent on reason, coherence, and belief. Strip away those pillars, and what remains is theatre, ritual without meaning, power without legitimacy. Chasseneuil himself went on to glory. His career blossomed, his reputation as a jurist cemented by the fame of his defense of the rats. He rose to prominence, his name remembered in legal circles long after autumn's famine had ended, and the rats had disappeared into the forgotten corners of history. His brilliance, born of absurdity, became a foundation for later generations of legal thought. And yet, beneath the admiration, there lingered a darker truth, that his fame had been purchased with the humiliation of a town and the suffering of its poor. He had triumphed not by saving men, but by defending vermin, and in doing so had shown that sometimes law serves not justice but its own perpetuation, its own vanity. The people of autumn were not remembered. Their hunger, Their anger, their sense of betrayal, all were swallowed by the legend of the trial. Historians preserve the tale because of its strangeness, its grotesque humor, not because of the suffering it represented. The peasants who had gathered outside the courthouse, their bellies empty, became invisible. What endured was not their desperation, but the cleverness of a lawyer who argued that rats deserved safe passage. History has a way of polishing tragedy into anecdote, of transforming human suffering into curiosity for the amusement of later generations. Autumn became a punchline, its pain erased by laughter. But if one listens closely, beneath the laughter, another sound emerges, the gnawing in the dark, the restless scurrying that no law can silence. For the rats were never judged, never punished, never tamed. They remained, both in body and in symbol, haunting reminders of the forces men cannot control. In their silence they mocked the court. In their absence they revealed the futility of summons and decrees. They triumphed not because they were defended, but because they belonged to the realm of chaos, a realm beyond the reach of men's fragile institutions. The trial did not discipline them. It merely exposed the impotence of those who believed discipline was possible. And so the story of the rats of autumn lingers, not as comedy, not even as tragedy, but as parable. It is a warning about the perils of law detached from reality, about the dangers of institutions that mistake ritual for substance. It is a reminder that justice is not found in the perfection of rules, but in their capacity to address human suffering. When law forgets its purpose, when it clings to logic at the expense of life, it becomes what it was in autumn, a spectacle, a theater of absurdity played out while children starved. The rats, in their way, forced the court to reveal its true face, not as guardian of the people, but as performer of hollow ritual. The absurdity of animal trials eventually faded as Europe modernized, swept away by Enlightenment reason and scientific thought. Yet the temptation they represent never truly vanished. Again and again throughout history, courts and governments have pursued enemies as unreachable as the rats of autumn, ideas, movements, abstractions that cannot be summoned or contained. Again and again, institutions have mistaken ritual for power, words for action, and in doing so have revealed their own impotence. The trial of the rats is not merely a medieval oddity, it is a mirror held up to all ages, including our own, reflecting the thin line between justice and farce. Autumn's humiliation lives on as a whisper, a story retold in the margins of history books, often with a smile. But perhaps it deserves to be remembered with a shudder instead. For beneath the laughter lies the grim truth, that a town's suffering was eclipsed by spectacle, that hunger was ignored in favor of ritual, that the law, in its vanity, became complicit in the very injustice it was meant to prevent. The rats were never judged because they could not be judged, and in their immunity they exposed the powerlessness of men who believed they ruled the world. In the end, autumn lost not only its grain, but its dignity, its faith in justice, its place in history. The rats, faceless and countless, carried no shame. Chasseneuil carried only glory. The people carried the silence of the forgotten. And perhaps that is the truest verdict of all, that in the court of history, the powerless are always absent, their voices gnawed away like the grain in autumn's cellars, leaving only the echo of their hunger. And so the tale of the town that lost a case against rats endures, grotesque and haunting, absurd and profound. It is a story about law and its limits, about hunger and its cruelties, about the eternal struggle between order and chaos. But above all, it is a reminder that sometimes the greatest humiliation is not defeat, but irrelevance, when the court calls for justice and no one, not even the rats, bothers to answer.